Number 8. Chicago Tylenol Murders. Chicago, Illinois is known for its amazing architecture and rich history. But did you know that in 1982, a string of mysterious deaths shook the city to its core? On September 29th of that year, a little girl named Mary Kellerman died after taking some Tylenol. Then on the same day in a nearby Chicago neighborhood, another person, Adam Janis, also lost his life in the same way. 2 more victims from the Janis family were killed by the pills, and so too were 3 other unrelated people nearby. Police soon realized what the link between these strange deaths was, and after some investigating, they discovered that each of the Tylenol pills had been laced with a lethal amount of potassium cyanide. When told that their product was killing people, the company who made the pills, Johnson & Johnson, stopped production of Tylenol immediately. Warnings were sent out to the public, advising people not to take or ingest any substance containing acetaminophen. Investigators determined that the bottles used by the victims all came from different factories, so they knew someone had to have tampered with the product at the retail level. A man named James William Lewis eventually came forward with claims that he'd laced the pills. He sent a few letters to Johnson & Johnson, saying he'd only stop if they gave him $1 million. Obviously, detectives had to look into the matter in order to see if he was actually responsible. In the end, they found out that James lived in New York and that he had 0 ties to Chicago, meaning he wasn't responsible for the Tylenol deaths. But he was still sentenced to 13 years in prison for extortion. Sadly, this case is still cold, and no one knows who poisoned the pain med. This incident did lead to stricter standards on pharmaceutical products though, and after the murders, tampering with medication became a serious federal crime. Number 7. LaGuardia Airport Bombing. One of the biggest reasons for added security nowadays at airports is because of the September 11th attacks on New York's World Trade Center towers. That tragedy is still a sensitive topic for millions of people, and it completely changed how American airports run. But did you know that in 1975, another disaster happened in New York at the LaGuardia Airport? While there weren't as many deaths as 9/11, innocent lives were taken. On December 29, 1975, a bomb with the power and force of 25 sticks of dynamite was hidden inside a locker located at one of the airport's baggage claim areas. When it was ignited at around 6:30 p.m., it sent shrapnel flying in every direction, claiming the lives of 11 people. Overall, 74 others were seriously injured. Responding firemen had to use countless gallons of water to put out the flames in the terminal. The destruction even spread to some taxi stands outside the building. Some of the victims were completely unrecognizable thanks to the severe injuries they sustained, and a majority of the wounded were on the brink of death. Even though it's not talked about much after being overshadowed by 9/11, the LaGuardia attack is often thought of as one of the bloodiest terrorist assaults on U.S. soil. Investigators weren't left with much usable evidence after first responders put out the flames. After some time, they determined that the bomb seemed homemade. No terrorist group ever stepped forward to say they carried out the bombing, so any leads as to who was responsible for the attack were slim to none. Later on, it was accepted that the people responsible were either anti-Yugoslavian Croats or people who wanted to frame the group. Number 6. Hinterkaifeck. Over 100 years ago in Hinterkaifeck, Germany, a family and their maid were brutally murdered. In total, 6 people were killed in March 1922 on a secluded farm in the middle of nowhere. To this day, the case is unsolved and no one was charged for the crime, making it one of Germany's oldest cold cases. In April of that year, the victim's neighbor realized that mail was piling up at the farm next door. Lorenz Schlittenbauer quickly became worried, so he got 2 of his friends to help him investigate. When they got to the small homestead, they immediately noticed that the front door was locked tight. Not knowing what else to do after knocking several times, they checked out the property's barn. As they opened the door, the stench of death overtook them. The dead bodies of Victoria Gabrielle, her 7-year-old daughter Cecilia, and the woman's parents, Cecilia Gruber and Andreas Gruber, were inside. Each of them had sustained blunt force injuries to their heads, and they were piled on top of each other. Whoever killed them put some hay and a board in place to hide them, but the smell of rotting flesh is hard to hide. This gruesome sight led the neighbors to a hallway connected to the main house where the family's maid, Maria Baumgartner, and Victoria's 2-year-old son, Josef, were found slain in their beds. Investigators determined that the crime happened on March 31st, 4 days before the victims were discovered. A day later, some salesmen knocked on the door and saw that smoke was coming out of the chimney. They could also tell the farm animals had been fed that day, as if someone was inside the home ignoring them. Unfortunately, before detectives had a chance to go to the crime scene and look for evidence, Schlittenbauer and his friends had already notified neighbors and everyone who lived nearby. The police were 45 miles away, so by the time they got to the farm, everything was compromised. Over a dozen people visited the site of the murders to see for themselves what happened, and so it was nearly impossible to find usable material after the fact. All kinds of strange theories emerged in the wake of this case. Some believe that Schlittenbauer was the killer. He and Victoria were allegedly in a romantic relationship, with some saying he was the real father of Josef, the 2-year-old victim. Others believe the murderer was Victoria's late husband, Carl, who was killed in World War I. The man's body was never recovered, so people think he may have come back to the family's farm to take revenge. In 2007, a few students at the First and Feldbruck Police Academy reopened the case. With new technology for analyzing evidence, they ruled out every potential suspect except one. They weren't able to fully determine whether or not this person was the killer, but they couldn't find anything saying they weren't either. But since the suspect was already dead, the students decided not to publicly share the name to respect the person's living relatives. Number 5. Oakland County Child Killer. Between 1976 and 1977, Michigan was haunted by a demonic murderer, who'd later be remembered as the Oakland County Child Killer. The first victim was a 12-year-old boy named Mark Stebbins. His mother reported him missing when he hadn't come home by 11 p.m. one night. Mark's body was discovered just 4 days after the report in a Southfield, Michigan parking lot. The person who found him initially thought it was a mannequin, but they were horrified when they realized it was a dead child. Authorities say the boy was strangled to death and had also been sexually assaulted. After Mark's murder, the deaths of 4 other children were tied to the Oakland killer, with each of the subsequent victims also having been assaulted. While the case is still unsolved, one of the main suspects is a man named Christopher Bush. He was a known pedophile who dealt with child pornography and was accused of grooming and taking advantage of a teenager named Vincent Gunnels. In November 1978, Bush's body was found after a successful suicide attempt. When police looked through his apartment, they saw a drawing of a disturbed child who looked eerily similar to Mark Stebbins. It's possible that Bush worked with Gunnels to carry out the murders. This claim was substantiated by the fact that a hair belonging to the teenager was discovered on the body of one of the female victims. Hopefully, as DNA technology improves, we'll one day learn who the killer actually was, so the family of the victims can finally get peace after decades of uncertainty. Do you know about any strange crimes nobody talks about? Tell us about them in the comments down below. And if you're enjoying the video so far, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel to join the Badger fam. Number 4. Daniel LaPlante. On May 15, 1970, Daniel LaPlante was born in Townsend, Massachusetts. During his early childhood, he faced both verbal and psychological abuse at the hands of his own father. Then once Daniel entered teenage years, his psychiatrist, someone who was supposed to help him, took advantage of him in a vulnerable state. By 15 years old, the boy had a reputation in his neighborhood for being a thief. Eventually, he stopped stealing petty items and instead started messing with people's minds. Sometimes, he'd move stuff around their house just to freak them out. And things only escalated when Daniel met a 15-year-old girl named Tina Bowen. The two went on a date during a school break, but after hearing about some alleged rape charges against Daniel, Tina's father Frank put an end to their relationship. The boy couldn't accept this though, so in the fall of 1986, he found a crawl space at the Bowen family home and let himself in. From inside, he was able to carefully watch Tina. He saw the girl and her sister make an attempt to contact their dead mom with a Ouija board. After seeing this, Daniel took it upon himself to start acting like a ghost. He began writing strange messages on the family's walls, and he also emptied bottles, rearranged things, and even pinned a knife to one of the Bowens family photos. Eventually, Frank found Daniel in a closet. He had face paint on and was wearing a mask while holding a sharp hatchet. He somehow escaped after Tina called the police. Investigators found the teenager 2 days later inside the family's basement. For about a year, the teenager was placed in a juvenile detention center until his mom pulled enough money together to bail him out. And that's when Daniel did something unforgivable. On December 1st, 1987, the teen took a stolen firearm to the family home of Priscilla Gustafson. After he arrived, he sexually assaulted Priscilla, who happened to be pregnant, before shooting her in the head twice. Daniel then drowned her son William in the bathroom. When he was on his way out of the house, Priscilla's daughter Abigail arrived home from school, and in order to cover his tracks, he also killed her in one of the home's bathrooms. After all of that, he simply went home without a care in the world. Police were able to easily attach Daniel to the crime scene and pin the gruesome murder on him. A jury found him guilty and sentenced the teenager to life in prison. The boy showed no remorse for his actions, and he even cracked a smile in the courtroom as his charges were read. Number 3. Robert Pickton. One murderer you might not have heard of is Robert Pickton. Back in 2007, the man was officially found guilty of killing 6 women, but some reports say he's responsible for as many as 49 deaths. He was mainly raised by his mother Louise in Canada, where his family owned a pig farm. She made Robert and his brother work long hours, and it was a brutal environment that warped the man's mind from an early age. Some reports make claims that the killer used to go inside the dead body of pigs when he needed to hide from the world. Robert's peers weren't fond of him either, since he usually smelled like, well, dead animals. Because of this and his poor performance at school, he dropped out. His murder spree began when Robert and his brother converted a pig slaughterhouse into a massive event space. There, they held large raves and parties where sex workers, bikers, and other undesirables would visit for a good time. In the early 2000s, one of the workers at their farm, Bill Hiscox, realized that many of the women who visited the property mysteriously vanished. Investigators eventually came to Robert's farm and found DNA samples belonging to 26 different women, some of which were stabbed. Others, however, were killed through an antifreeze injection. The killer took many of his victims to a meat grinding facility before feeding their remains to his pigs. Further details are deeply disturbing, but if you're interested, feel free to look up the case. Robert received life in prison for what he did, and he'll go down in history as one of Canada's most prolific killers. Number 2. Child of Rage. Our next story doesn't involve a murderer, but instead a little girl with an extremely troubled childhood. In 1985, Beth Thomas was born in the US. A year after she came into the world, her mother died, leaving little Beth and her brother Jonathan in the care of their father. Sadly, he wasn't a good man. In fact, he was far from it. From the time she was 19 months old, he abused Beth in all the worst ways imaginable. Eventually, though, child welfare workers rescued the kids from the evil man, and they were subsequently placed in the care of a Christian couple named Tim and Julie, who hadn't been notified of the Thomas children's dark past. However, after spending time with Beth, they quickly figured out something was wrong. She was later diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder, likely due to the early childhood trauma she experienced, and this disorder is what caused her to act out. At one point, the child openly admitted to wanting to kill her adoptive parents and her brother. Beth even stole a few knives and smiled menacingly when she was asked about it. Because of this, her new mom and dad were terrified and felt the need to lock her door at night. Like many psychopaths, Beth hurt animals and sometimes even killed them. And after experiencing sexual abuse at the hands of her father, she also inappropriately touched Jonathan multiple times. She once even pushed the boy down a set of stairs, causing him to hit his head on some concrete. In 1992, a film was created based on the little girl's life. Her story shocked many, making them realize the limits a child can be pushed to. Luckily, Beth seems to be doing much better nowadays. She received help from therapists and has since graduated from nursing school. She serves as a living example that despite how terrible your childhood is, you can always turn your life around. Number 1. The Pizza Murders. In 1997, 2 innocent men were brutally murdered by a pair of curious teenagers. 17-year-old Jason Vreeland and 18-year-old Thomas Koskovich decided to place an order for pizza one night. They called Tony's Pizza and Pasta, asking for 2 cheese pizzas to be delivered to 196 Scott Road in Sussex County, New Jersey. But when the delivery workers, Jeremy Giordano and Giorgio Gallara, went to finish the order, they realized the address they'd been given was an abandoned house. And to their surprise, the teens were waiting outside. Jason told the delivery men that he had money, but instead of pulling some cash out, he grabbed a pistol. Then, in quick succession, he fired all 7 of the gun's bullets at the victim's car. Jason and Thomas then pulled Jeremy and Giorgio out of the vehicle before shooting them to death. Some reports say that the killers were shocked they actually carried through with the murders. They apparently said, "I can't believe we did this," before hugging and driving away from the crime scene. Police arrested the teenagers on April 21, 1997. They found the gun used in the murders as well as bloody clothing inside Thomas's house. While Thomas was handed the death penalty, Jason was given life in prison. The only reason the pair committed the crime was apparently due to morbid curiosity. Which one of these crimes freaked you out the most? Let us know in the comments down below. And remember to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Bad Badger. Bye guys!